All right. Welcome everyone to the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust webinar. Tonight it's titled Documenting and Managing Pennypack Trust Native Plant Communities. I'm Maria Palamugnani. I'm the Research and Restoration Coordinator here at the Trust. And as many of you know, the Trust has a long history of agricultural disturbance, and our native plants struggle with heavy deer browse and invasive plants. But fortunately, we have experienced and dedicated staff members who are more than up to the task of managing our 853 acres. It's my pleasure to introduce one of those people tonight, Sam Makler. Many of you may know him from the plant propagation workshop that he led last month. Sam has a degree in landscape architecture from Temple University, and he joined the Trust over 3 years ago as an intern with a lot of landscaping experience. But he is not your average intern. Sam had a keen interest in historical plant surveys conducted at the Trust, especially during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Those are kind of our peak survey years. And he spent a lot of his free time outside of his internship just roaming the hundreds of acres we have at the Trust, teaching himself plants and comparing what he saw wandering around to those records. And this is just amazing to me. He took the initiative to log all these observations, and he actually discovered many plant species that were previously never recorded at the Trust. Like, how amazing is that? So, Sam, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge of the Trust plant communities with all of us tonight, and I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, MP. That is a great introduction. I had to say MP has helped me a ton with this presentation that I'll be showing tonight. So thank you again, MP. And thank you guys all for coming out. This is something that is near and dear to my heart. And it's the first time I'm getting to sort of present all this information into one place. So yeah, thank you again for coming out. And we'll jump right in here. So who am I at the Trust? Who am I? MP kind of gave an introduction to my background. Let's see here. Oh, I missed a slide. So my sort of position in the Trust started under this umbrella of stewardship. So I work alongside maybe 5-6 people, depending, full-time staff, and there's always volunteers and other sort of individuals that we're fortunate enough to have tag along. But my interest leaned towards horticulture in the beginning, towards the plants, and now that's sort of been the emphasis of my position in the Trust. So all of us in stewardship sort of have different specialties, and we wear kind of many different hats. So I wanted to show these 4 pictures. I thought that was sort of a great side-by-side and different comparison, or just a visual really, of all the different things that you might find us doing. And this bottom right-hand picture, that's me taking a picture, and that picture will show up later on in the presentation. So feel free to comment if you think you can find that. It'll be a fun challenge. So this is a side-by-side here, and I want to use this briefly here to talk about what I'm going to be speaking about tonight is individual plants, the plant records that we have, and also plant communities, how we manage them. But on top of all that, I want to use that information as a way to sort of describe and give some insights into our planning and management process that not everyone really gets to see. The physical changes that happen in the landscape are things that people who experience and walk through the landscape are going to get to see. But this is sort of the invisible side of the Trust. So again, super excited to be able to share that with you guys. So these 2 comparisons, this side by side, this on the left-hand side is a picture of Virginia bluebells blooming under a canopy of tulip poplars in one of our woodlands. It's one of my favorite places to go early in the spring. And it's a site that is sort of pristine in a way. On the right-hand side, we see, unfortunately, another condition that can be found all too often in the Trust, which is a disturbed condition. It's invaded. We see this hedgerow that has a ton of climbing vines, the usual suspects, porcelainberry, multiflora rose, wineberry, all the stuff that you can think of is kind of growing in this location. So the left-hand side is showing a sort of a mode of management, which would be preservation, right? We look at this space and think, how do we preserve what's that sort of rich plant community that's growing here? And then on the right-hand side, we're thinking, how do we restore what's happening here? How do we get it to a different sort of standard or a different composition of plants? Because we know that these invasive species are obviously to detriment of the surrounding area. So at the very bottom, at the very base layer, what we're looking at is this idea of sort of preservation and restoration. And so today, tonight rather, as we move through these slides and the different information about individual plants and plant communities, all of that information is going to tie back in on how we do or sort of design our management and our different strategies for different areas in the trust. So moving right along here. So on the left-hand side, right-hand side, it's another sort of comparison. This is a before and after in a place called Beth Ayres Woods. Again, a tulip poplar kind of dominated canopy, and it's a woodland that, unfortunately, on the left-hand side, we're seeing an understory that's just dominated with wineberry, some multiflora rose, and again, some of the usual suspects. And so on the right-hand side, you see that what it looks like when it gets cleaned out. We came in, we mowed it, and I had to say, when we did this, it felt really good, right? You didn't have that visual, you didn't see the problem right in front of you. But this was a big lesson to be learned, which was that the party was only really just beginning here. We cut it down, but now we have to think about all of the long-term management that's going to need to take place to sustain the work we've done. And that's just to say, let's not have those plants come back, right? But then there's all the other variables we need to think about. What plants are going to get put in, and there's just, again, a multitude of things that need to be considered. So moving right along here. So the map here showing the trust, again, I just want to kind of emphasize the complexity of all of the sort of strategy and our management plans, all of the things we need to consider. So, the previous slide is telling us that we need to be thinking on a really long time scale, right? We can't just think that a job is ever fully completed. This map is now showing the diversity of the landscape, right? So not only do we have wetlands and woodlands and meadows, well, all of those areas have a sort of a level of whether or not, they're invaded or if they're in good condition. There's sort of a quality of those landscapes. And then they're all diverse in terms of the plant composition. So every little area of the trust, every place that you're standing is sort of is unique in that way. So it needs to be treated as a unique place. There's no real catch-all for one area. So again, I really just want to emphasize that sort of complexity that we're dealing with when it comes to managing these spaces. So now we'll jump right into the history of plant records at PERT, right? So this is sort of the starting point for a lot of this. And I think it's one of the most interesting things that we have, one of the best tools we have at the Trust. And we're really, truly fortunate to have a rich history of plant records. So the first record that we will reference, and that is, I think, found really, the oldest record that I've been able to find is a write-up from a botanist named Alexander McElwee, and it's called The Flora of Edge Hill Ridge near Willow Grove and Its Ecology. This was submitted to the Academy of Natural Sciences in the 1900s. Well, 1900, it was almost 100. It was our earliest record, and then we wouldn't have another record for almost 70 years. So it was relative to the second set of records. This is a very, very old set of data here. So this was formatted in a way that really emphasized individual species, and it was only classified. If you see on the right-hand side here, we have just a screenshot of what that document looked like. And we see that all the plants that were recorded, and there was around 71 plants recorded into three groups: sunshine plants, shade plants, and bog plants. And so this record is really valuable in that it gives us some insights into some really old historic aspects of the landscape that are unfortunately no longer present. So on the left-hand side, I have some notable species, things like tawny cotton grass or rose pogonia, roundleaf sundew. These were all plants, and this composition of plants was sort of indicative of a coastal plain plant community. So we are in the Piedmont, but this was a coastal plain outlier, and unfortunately, most of it was lost to development. So that is sort of a way that we're looking at a record to see how, potentially one negative force like development can lead to a lack of or a loss of plant diversity rather. But still, many plants on this list are still found in and around the trust today. So not only is it sort of gives insight into some negative forces and some threats to plant diversity, it tells us what things have held on, and it gives us some indication of ecosystem health in the places that they're located. So this I just thought is so cool. From Alexander McElwee, these are some herbarium samples that are currently at the New York Botanical Garden. On the left-hand side, we have Erioforum virginicum. On the right, green ash, Fraxinus pennsylvanica. This left-hand side plant, again, is sort of endemic to bog. So you'll find it in coastal plain and boggy areas. And that is no longer present around this trust because of the loss of its habitat. On the right-hand side, we see another threat, right? We know the ashes are currently being really beaten up pretty bad by the emerald ash borer. So again, these historical records can give us really strong insights onto how negative forces in and around the landscape can have a detrimental impact on our plant diversity. Let's see here. Oh, I missed one. So moving forward here, oh, no, I want to go back to this one because this is a positive slide here. I don't want to miss this one. So Viola primulifolia, right? Primrose leaved violet. This is a plant, again, that was at the herbarium. It's a herbarium sample from this Edge Hill Ridge. And I forgot to mention that is kind of located where Pennypack Parkway is, around Turwood Road, and then down into the Huntington Valley Golf Course. So that sort of area is where his focus was. And so where this was sampled from, we still have that plant standing today. So again, it's a sort of example of a positive, right, that can be extracted from that historical information. Now moving along here, annotated list of native and inventive vascular plants of Pennypack Preserve. So 76, John D. Mitchell really gave us an invaluable resource of almost 400 plants on record for in and around the trust the sort of boundaries that we have today. Many of these species, unlike the McElwee survey, are still present. And this data set gave us a whole new sort of group of supplementary information. So unlike the McElwee survey that just had, classifications into 3 sort of broad categories, this gives us the habitat a plant might grow in, whether or not it's native, non-native, the plant or the insect associations, the fruit dispersal or seed dispersal. So all of this extra information that we get to use, and some of the notable species from that, Canada lily, downy rattlesnake plantain, green comet milkweed. So there's these really great, rare, uncommon species that are recorded that we can look at and sort of see what the standing of those species are today. On the bottom, we have pictures of bushy bluestem and Dutchman's breeches, 2 rare species from that list that are still standing. And many, 1 or 2 populations in and around the trust, but they're still holding on strong. So it gives us a ton of information to reference back to. One other resource we can use is iNaturalist. So recently, we've really been utilizing the functions of iNaturalist, which is an app and also a website that you can use to record observations of plants that you're seeing. It's typically done through a phone. So you'll take a picture of a plant and submit it through the program, and it'll actually record the exact locations of those plants. So now we're adding another element of information to these records, which is exact location, right? So now we're able to look and see exactly where a plant may have been located in the trust. And if we ever want to go back to a specific plant, it's very easy to navigate through the app. So we're adding sort of layers of information here into the plant record, and each thing as an individual record is useful, but then as they all start to relate to one another, we can really extract a ton of information. This is another sort of way about going, or a way of going about understanding the records and information we have. This is sort of the vegetative classification system we can use to relate individual species and plant community. So much like the binomial nomenclature, the way that we sort of organize plant from species, genus, family, order, class, we can do a similar thing in a sort of a classification for plant communities. So at the very bottom level, we'll have association, alliance, group, and we move all the way up. So you can have a small, say, little pool of water in a woodland, and the plants that grow around that can be related all the way up to the woodland and broader areas that might grow in and a part of. So this is another sort of reference and a tool that we'll use to understand how plants as an individual, the plants that grow around that individual, how they fit into the larger picture. So one other resource, NatureServe, and also Pennsylvania Natural Heritage, they both have a system of documentation of plant communities and the sort of standing that they have in the vegetative classification hierarchy. So on the left-hand side is a screenshot of a plant called Andropogon gyran. So Elliott's bluestem, which we have in the trust. You can type that in and see how what its conservation status is in Pennsylvania. And then you get this regional context. So what's happening, what is it standing around Pennsylvania and other states? And that's actually another function of iNaturalist that I forgot to mention as well, is you get all of this surrounding information. You can see where is that growing in your town, in your county, in the state, and in the country. So all of these resources can be used to fill in missing gaps in how we're looking at plants and plant records. So lastly here, and I would say the most exciting part of this is just the most recent form of plant record keeping at the Trust. And this was sort of started from MP, and I was fortunate enough to jump along on this, is the meander surveying that we do. So this is a system of recording plants, and at 50 meters we'll drop a quadrat, which you can see in the top right corner there. And so we're looking at every single plant that grows in that quadrat, and we get percentages of how many of those plants are growing, and what is the percentage of plants growing in that quadrat. And so now we're able to extract a new bit of information from our record keeping, which is abundance. So how much of a plant is growing in an area, and in the quadrat, and then in the sort of the woodland or the area that's found in. So that amount or that form of information, again, highly valuable, and it gets brought in to the larger pool of information and can be utilized to make all kinds of different connections to previous information. So that's sort of our current standing, and we've done this in 3 locations so far. This is a satellite showing Beth Ayres Woods. So the meander surveying that was done in Beth Ayres Woods, which was a very exciting process to take part of. So now we'll jump into some notable species that have been recorded over the last several years. We'll start off with just the kind of process of how this really began and some of the first really noteworthy species that were found. And then we'll jump into the plants that have not actually shown up on other records. So plants that were documented that have not yet been seen. And then we'll go into some species that have been recorded on one or maybe all of the plant records, but are still standing today as rare or very uncommon plants, which can be used as indicators of the overall health of the areas that they grow in. So first and foremost, here's a plant. This is sort of one of the first plants that really was an exciting find. It doesn't look very exciting when you look at it here in this picture, but this was just the start. So we kept finding this plant in 1 or 2 nearby areas. We would see this. And because of the historical record, we were able to look at that and sort of pin it to a genus, right? So it looked like a Platanthera, which is a type of orchid, but unfortunately, due to a negative threat in the landscape, which is the deer browse, it kept getting munched up. It kept getting browsed and eaten, and we could never get a floral structure. We would never bloom, and we could never get a positive ID to a species level. So we put one of the tree cages. So the cages that you'll see in the landscape that we use to protect trees from antler rub and potentially from some browsing. We use that on a herbaceous species, right? So one of these smaller flowering plants, and it yielded really great results. So we ended up getting this plant, Platanthera lacera, which is ragged fringed orchid. We were able to have that bloom due to the cage that we put around it. And that was sort of the start of trying to identify some of these plants that were getting eaten and not allowing us to record it, but it was also not being allowed to flower and set seed and potentially expand its population around it. So here's another example of that. This was one that we were able to look at, and again, not so exciting when it's just growing like this, but we were able to look at this and say this has to be a lily. And we looked at the historical record, and we had some rare documentation, or a documentation of a plant called Canada lily, Lilium canadens, but it was rare. So we wanted to cage this up to really get to see what this was, and hopefully have it flower. And so this was a tricky one because the deer this seems to be their absolute favorite plant to eat. So if we were seeing 4, 5, 6 of these plants, there was not one way to find it and cage it before the deer. They just beat us to it every single time. So this one actually took a year. So we put a tree cage around it and had to wait the whole year in hopes that it would come up the following year and flower. And so in the last July, we were fortunate enough to have one of these lilies bloom. And this was actually a species called Lilium superbum, Turks cap lily, which looks sort of like some of the ornamental non-native lilies, but this is actually quite a rare species for our area. And unfortunately, it has really lessened in populations in not only the Pennypack, but our nearby natural areas because of deer browse. So yeah, one really exciting species. This is one I love. I could just talk about this for God knows how long. So we'll move along. Here's one other plant with a similar, had a similar sort of standing with deer browse. It kept getting chewed up, and we could not even get close to really an ID on this. You can even see up top some of the floral buds starting to show, but each time I would come back to this, it would get hit. And you can even see some of the nearby plants hardly growing because of deer browse. So this turned out to be a plant called hypericum virginicum. It's actually a St. John's wort, which are traditionally yellow flowers, but this is this beautiful white and pink flower. And due to caging, it really sort of came to life. But this plant had really, it was one small plant in one little location. So we actually got to utilize another tool outside of the tree caging, which was propagation. So we took seed from just one flower and were able to grow 6 or 7 plants from that. That opened up a whole new series of challenges, right? As do all these plants. Once we get them to flower, we need to ask ourselves, what plant community is this a part of? How do we need to preserve, now that we've preserved the individual plant and got it to flower, how do we preserve the area around it to sustain the population? And so this is another tool to utilize, which is propagation. And this really was an interesting challenge. Where is an appropriate place in the trust to plant this? Where is a responsible place in the trust to plant this, so that we can ensure ourselves that this population and this sort of local ecotype and these sort of genes of this plant, that it may be found far off from here, but this is specific and is adapted to the trust. And so we want to preserve that as best as we can. And so finding the suitable place was a challenge, but we'll get to that later on, and you'll see exactly sort of the fate that this met, which is very exciting. So here we'll just jump through a few slides of just pictures of some other species that are newly recorded for the trust. They were not on any of our previous records. So starting off here, we have splenium americanum. This is American golden saxifrage. It's a highly reduced flower. It is that is the flower you're looking at there, and it's a very, very small plant. Most of these pictures were taken with a macro lens, so they're very tiny. This actually grows in woodlands, in little seeps and little wet spots within woodlands, and is an incredible indicator for soil, water, the health of the system around it, really. On the right-hand side, oh, and one other thing about that plant is it is fun. It's very funny when we think about spring ephemerals, which we'll see more of as we go along. This is one of the earliest plants to bloom, and I love to think of it as a spring ephemeral, but it is it's very easy to miss. So I wanted to highlight that here. Bartonia virginica, yellow screw stem on the right-hand side. It's even maybe just as interesting or more. It's actually a gentian. It's in the gentian family. It's actually an annual, so it drops its seed and is reliant on that seed to germinate so that it survives into the next or creates a population that following year. So this will grow on little hummocks, little mounds in wetlands. So mounds that have mosses and different mosses. Most often we see it on sphagnum moss. And it's again, another highly reduced flower. That's about as best as you'll get in terms of the flower opening up. But it's an incredibly interesting plant and one that's very, very rare. Here we go on the left-hand side here. We have one of my favorites, Elliott's blue stem. This is Andropogon gyrans, and it is, it tends to grow in, it'll grow in meadows, but it tends to grow along another plant, Andropogon virginicus, broom sedge, and can easily be kind of lost in the patches of broom sedge. So for every, say, 100 plants of broom sedge, where Elliott's blue stem grows, it'll grow, one of these will grow per 100 broom sedge. So very easy to miss, but it's got a really beautiful kind of flower. And then the way it sets seed, very beautiful. And it is very rare. This is our sort of the northernmost range of that plant. And it's only showed up 1 or 2 times. There's only 1 or 2 real populations all within the same area. On the right-hand side, we have Dryopteris clintoniana. This is probably one of the rarest plants on this list, Clinton's wood fern. And this is actually a hybrid between Dryopteris goldiana and Dryopteris cristata, which one Goldie's wood fern and then crested wood fern. Both of these have to be in the right proximity to hybridize, and both of those plants are very, very rare in the landscape. So there's a lot of variables that need to line up perfectly for this plant to exist, and we're fortunate enough to have that. All right, so here's Turk's cap lily again. I know I went over that, but it's such a beautiful plant. I figured it wouldn't hurt to show it twice, and it is new to our list. We do have Lilium canadense, like I previously mentioned, but Lilium superbum is new to the list, and from that, the process of putting small cages around them, we're hoping we'll get several more species each year to add on, so it's not just this single plant flowering. On the right, we have pine sap monotropa. It's one of the monotropas, very similar to ghost pipe. So you guys may be familiar with ghost pipe, which grows in many woodlands, and it's actually a parasitic plant. So it's lacking chlorophyll here. There's no real green. It doesn't photosynthesize the way these other plants do. It actually taps into the mycorrhizal network around it. So it's kind of an interesting plant. And this one is much rarer than the ghost pipes that we commonly find. So again, another one to add to the list. And so all of these plants are, these plants here that are shown don't make up the entirety of the list of new plants. There's many others that are grasses and some sedges and things that aren't as visually interesting. I personally think they're as interesting, but I really wanted to show you the stuff that is really beautiful to see. So we'll jump into some stuff that is still standing in the trust, plants that are rare and uncommon, that are still present in small populations and are used as indicators about the health and the functions of the systems that they're a part of. So on the left, we have bushy blue stem, one of my favorites. Again, another blue stem. We saw Elliott's blue stem earlier. This plant, bushy blue stem, grows in wetland areas, and it's typically found in the coastal plain, in the pine barren. So this is a really sort of interesting plant grouping that we have here, or a little community of bushy blue stem rather that we have, and it's really holding on strong. There's only one population, but as you can see here, there's plenty of plants within it. On the right hand side, we have one flowered cancer root, again another parasitic plant that has only really, it's very rare in the records. It only shows up in one of the records, and it is again parasitic plant that you'll find in sort of shaded understories, lacking chlorophyll, but a beautiful flower to see. Easy to miss, but if you can get up close to it, it's really beautiful. Here we go, two spring ephemerals, both in the buttercup family, Ranunculaceae. On the left, we have Hepatica americana, round-lobed Hepatica, and then on the right-hand side, we have rue anemone. These are both rare on all the lists that they show up on, and uncommon. And they, for us, they're only showing up in both respectively have their own location, and unfortunately tend to get chewed, or eaten by deer. So we've put cages around both of these, and are kind of looking into the larger picture that they're a part of. One other buttercup actually here is marsh marigold, kaltha palustris. And this one is funny. I put it on here and I'm thinking you guys are probably looking at that thinking that I'm crazy because it looks just like the plant that grows all over your lawn and in the backyard, lesser celandine. But this is a different species in the same family. And this grows again, in sort of seeps and wetland and open sunny areas. And we have one location where this grows. It's the flower's a little bit bigger than lesser celandine and the leaves are much bigger and morphologically they're much different. So a very interesting plant I wanted to add on here. And then coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. That's one you guys might be familiar with from the plant sale that we have, and it's very popular in the horticulture trade. But this is sort of this is growing in its sort of native conditions. And it's a very, very old plant. So we're pretty confident that this was not something that escaped any of our plantings or our plants that we sell or the plants that grow around the headquarters. So again, and it shows up on the historical record as a rare species for the trust. So very interesting plant to kind of see in the landscape, especially being that all the other honeysuckles that we see are unfortunately non-native. So that's kind of a standout among the rest. So last slide here is Lyonia ligostrina. This is, you'll probably notice, one plant that doesn't have a picture of a flower, and that's because it was actually discovered just this winter or fall rather. And this is just this single plant that's growing in the trust. And this sort of prefers and grows in transition areas that you might have a wooded edge and a wetland. And it'll grow in those edge habitats or the edges of those two habitats rather. And a very interesting plant in the Ericaceae family. So the heaths, and it is very similar to the vacciniums, the blueberries, the huckleberries, but it is its own sort of distinct genus and species. And again, just this one plant in the trust that we've found. On the far right is one last plant, star chickweed. This is a plant, excuse me, that we have a pretty sizable population. It is just one area it grows, but it's documented as a rare plant, but it's still holding on in the trust. So let's see here. Oh, 1 second. All right, let me just make sure. Okay, so now we're going to transition into the plant community. So how this relationship between we're kind of scaling up from the individual species into plant communities. These are sort of treated, when we think back to that hierarchy, that vegetation classification system, we can treat these as a community. We can look at that and see how rare that community actually is within the trust. And so there are several instances where we have these sort of rare plant communities, and just like we look at the individual species and scale up and say, how do we maintain the larger area, and then the larger area around that. Well, we're sort of now working one scale forward from the individual species and looking at these communities and really thinking about how we manage them properly. This is an example of a tussock sedge marsh we're focusing on here. On the left-hand side, we have a list of plants that is provided by the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program to define a plant or this specific plant community, again, a tussock sedge marsh. And so one area that we have grown alongside Crossroads Marsh, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with down in Creek Road, the list here that they've provided that is sort of the standard for the composition of this plant community in Pennsylvania. We meet all of those species. We have each one of them. In the bottom, we see in the red Phragmites and purple loosestrife, which are unfortunately invasive species that are such a consistent problem in this system that they're sort of included into this composition list. So we actively look out for Phragmites and purple loosestrife and manage for them in this system, in this plant community. And then one really interesting thing about this, if you guys can remember back that hypericum that I was talking about, how we propagated, we had several plants. Well, if you look, Marsh St. John's wort, it's classified or labeled as Triadinum virginicum, and there's been taxonomic changes, so now it's classified as Hypericum virginicum, which was what I was calling it. This was the one plant that was missing from this system, or this plant community. So after doing the research on this area and sort of studying the different plants within, we found it to be the most suitable area to reintroduce that species. And so we were able to take that one single plant that was highly threatened in one area and reintroduce it into this plant community, which is very, very exciting to do. Next, we'll jump into the warm season grass meadows. So here's actually a photo of cool season grasses. But the thing that makes the meadows so distinct is they're sort of a new plant community. And just like the tussock sedge marsh, you can use NatureServe and see the sort of the conservation status of that plant community. The warm season grass meadows are a very sort of imperiled plant community throughout the state. And so we were actually, it's the one example of us creating a kind of a man-made plant. We created that plant community ourselves, right? It's not part of a remnant system. It's not part of really the historical landscape, but we brought it to the trust and we're able to convert a really highly disturbed agricultural area and convert that into something that really needed to be sort of saved or introduced. Very similar to that hypericum, like in a much different scale, right? So this is a picture of the cool season grasses that were present before the introduction of many of the warm season grasses that we see today. And some of those species here include little blue stem, big blue, Indian grass. We have some panicums, and that plant community really it's done very well. So we as a community, it attracts a wide array of different animals, birds, insects, and things that will depend on the species that are sort of exclusive to that plant community. Now, we do have some problems with the warm season grasses. Just like everything else, it has its own sort of unique threats and issues. And so one of them is that to manage this properly, we need to spray, we need to use herbicide treatments to get rid of a lot of the invasives that will unfortunately encroach into these areas. And when we do that, we tend to lose some of the native broadleaf herbicides. So the broadleaf invasives we're able to treat with broadleaf herbicide, sort of selective spraying, so that the grasses are fine, the primary plants in this system, and the invasives go by the wayside. But we have some casualties, some native casualties, unfortunately, when we're trying to control those invasives. So our warm season grass meadows, which are sort of representative of like the tall grass prairie, the plants that should be growing in there are not only just the grasses, but a lot of other flowering broadleaf herbaceous plants. And we've lost a lot of that diversity because we're forced to control our invasives that are coming in. So that's a current issue and problem that we're trying to solve, and we're working on, and have a lot of different sort of kind of methods and strategies to work on that. So it's something I'm actually really looking forward to, and it's kind of an exciting problem to potentially be able to solve. But again, another kind of rare plant community within the trust. In this case, it's not as natural as, say, the tussock sedge marsh or the next location we'll look at, but it's just as sort of important to house this within the trust because of its sort of rarity and how threatened it is throughout the country. All right, lastly here for plant communities, we'll talk about one other rare place. And I should just mention, these are just 3 examples. There are tons of little pockets throughout the trust that have can just have amazing little groupings of plants. Not all can be technically classified under that, under those the classifications we spoke of earlier through NatureServe and PA Natural Heritage. But there's so much diversity throughout the trust. And so one area, again, the chestnut oak kind of system of oaks, and primarily chestnut oaks, that define one area in the parkway as a sort of very unique plant community. This is actually part of that system that was talked about through Alexander McElwee's survey in Edge Hill Ridge. And so this plant community is very distinct from the other 2, right? It's kind of a woodland, and within that, from the woodland down to the very sort of the herbaceous level and the ground level, we're seeing very different sort of kind of diversity in plant communities when you scale down. We have tons of oaks, and unfortunately the beeches, which are native species, have sort of begun to dominate the historically diverse canopy. So this is one area, and one other resource that I should mention here that is widely used by us when we're managing and creating strategies for this area is Dr. Robertson's management plan that was done in the 90s. While this was not technically a inventory of specific species, it was actually a direct management plan. In that, in the 1990s, he was noticing a trend of especially specifically in this area, deer browse was actually leading to a lack of regeneration from many of the oaks, specifically the chestnut oaks, the scarlet oaks. And since beeches are much less preferred, they're beginning to skew the canopy. The canopy is leaning much more towards beeches, and we're losing the diversity of oaks and many of the other hardwoods. Within that management plan, there's actually records of many other understory and shrub species that are unfortunately not present due to deer browse. So while this is a very sort of rare sort of location within the trust, we're unfortunately losing a lot of the diversity that was historically present. On the right-hand side, there's just a small seep within this area where we're seeing another little plant community that's reliant on the larger system of the oak upland forest, which is sort of this, it's almost like it's a wetland seep sort of area that houses tons of high bush blueberry, these little mounds of sphagnum moss, and a bunch of other herbaceous species. So this is an area we're also actively managing and developing a pretty strong management plan for. So now we'll just transition here. I want to talk about when earlier on I was talking about the sort of complexities when we were looking at the landscape and the diversity in our areas within the landscape. And so here I just want to emphasize that again by talking about how plant communities, as distinct as they may be, are sort of reliant on each other. They're all connected. And one way to look at that and examine the sort of relationships that or the whole multitude of different plant communities, we can examine the sort of connections to them by looking at insects. And in this case, we'll look at butterflies, right? So just to reinforce that idea of how complex these systems are and how much we need to take into considering when we develop management plans for. We'll talk about right here, we have the white M hair streak, right? So here's a picture that I took of it, the first recording we have of this butterfly. And this butterfly is actually, its host plant is several species of oak trees. But those oaks, it's not just the oak trees that we need to have this butterfly present at the trust. We also need a specific plant, which is what it's on in this picture on the left-hand side, which is a boneset. So its primary nectar source is boneset. Its host plant is the oaks. And so we're starting to find more and more of these relationships where you have these super distinct plant groupings, plant communities. In this case, you have a meadow and then a woodland edge butted right up to it. And that proximity, those relationships are so important for not just this gray or white M hair streak, but many other living things that we're only so sure about so many of them. I can't imagine the whole web of sort of complexities between the different plant communities and how many different things are reliant on those connections. So we do our best to try and consider them when we're forming our management plans. We want to not sever those connections. One other example we'll talk about is with two butterflies, coral hair streak. And all three of these butterflies are very sort of rare in themselves as records for the trust. Here's a coral hair streak on Asclepias tuberosa. And so this is kind of even more extreme. This one relies on black cherry as its host plant, and then we'll use Asclepias tuberosa as its nectar source. And it's a very rare condition to actually have enough black cherries in your woodland edge alongside a meadow that would house Asclepias tuberosa. We only have one location, but we have a very significant population of these coral hair streaks. So we look at that edge habitat, which is a part of a woodland, and we're looking at the meadow, and we're really trying our best to not treat those as distinct spaces because of, this is just one example, but we want to try and find those connections between areas that when you're looking at them seem worlds apart. One other butterfly on the right-hand side, one of my favorites, the harvester. This is actually the only carnivorous butterfly in North America, and I would say the most drastic or extreme example of just how sensitive some of these things can be or complex. The harvester feeds on woolly aphids that can be found on beech trees, alders, and some research indicates potentially hawthorn trees as well. But we have it on our beech trees, and so you actually need to have beech trees in the right location in the floodplain. You need to have a certain rot fungus that grows on beech trees that the woolly aphids will be able to survive on there. That's what they live on within the beech tree. So you're looking at, again, the tree, the fungus, the aphids, and that will potentially give you a population of harvesters. So I love these examples as just this sort of the ecology of these species, to see just how unbelievably complex the relationships they have. And again, many other things that we don't know about, and that just how complex those relationships are to the plants and the landscape that they're a part of. Let's see. I don't want to miss anything. So moving forward, right? So with all that information, with the plant records, the individual species, the plant communities, and some of the the animals or the insects that interact with them, what are we doing with that information moving forward? And so there's several things. One of the big things here is, let me just make sure, is scaling up that sort of tool of tree caging. So when we were looking at some of the orchids or that lily and several other species, and putting a little, maybe 12-inch or 18-inch tree cage around it, that was enough to protect the individual species from deer browse. But now we're sizing up and doing full-scale deer exclosures. There were several or maybe two, maybe three that were on the trust property from years past before I started, but unfortunately many of them were broken down and deer had entered those exclosures. And so now we're scaling up not only the amount, but we're also using much tougher materials. And so this is one I'm really, really excited for. Not only is it protecting things that you may find when you put the exclosure down, you may put it around, say, a lily, and now you have this 20-foot barrier around that, but it also will bring things out of the seed bank that you might not know are present. And so again, we're scaling up the amount of areas we're putting this in, and those areas are informed by our meander surveys, some historical records. We're able to utilize all that information to plan where these exclosures will be going. Another sort of tool and another sort of mode of strategy that we're starting to think about is how can our sort of traditional methods of land management that we've sort of haven't changed, haven't thought much into, how can small adjustments in those forms of management create some pretty drastic changes in plant composition and plant diversity, right? So this is an example from No Mow May, which we experimented with last year. And these are the paddocks in front of the barn over where we're stationed, the stewardship staff. We've had these mowed as just regular turf, and we let these grow out. And the plant composition, the plants that started, primarily grasses that grew in here, some non-native cool season species, but all of a sudden, out of a sort of sterile turf, we created this plant community that housed peck skippers, leaf skippers, tons of insects. Some of the turtles from the nearby pond were utilizing the space. There was just so much activity happening out of seemingly nowhere. So it's one example of how can we sort of make some small scale adjustments that might end up having massive results and some positive changes in the landscape that could potentially increase plant diversity and bring some plants into the picture that we might not have really thought about or seen. see. Lastly, here is the meander surveys. So scaling up those meander surveys. These are several areas that we've looked at, but we're planning on following up in those areas. So the first round was done in the spring and really early summer months. And so we'll revisit those areas and try to extract as much information throughout the season, so summer and potentially fall, and then also look at some new areas. So we're going to try and get a really complete picture on the ground, get as many species recorded as possible, utilizing that previous information to say, hey, here is some of the stuff that we're not seeing, we know was present. And so this is one thing I'm really looking for. I'm fortunate enough again to get to share this with MP. So looking into the next season, I know there's going to be tons of new stuff found. So this, again, scaling this up, just like the exclosures, and just like our management, scaling things up, taking it to a larger kind of a level in relation to all the work that's been done in documenting plants and plant communities. So I think that wraps it up, guys. I just want to say thank you all for coming out. It's just, again, something that is just so passionate about, and we're really fortunate. This is only really possible because of you guys and our members and all the support that we get. This is one facet of what we do at the Trust, and it's definitely having a really massive impact on the way we're going about things. So thank you guys again, and I look forward to seeing what questions you have here.
All right, thank you so much, Sam. That was great. I think you've made it clear that management at the Trust is a long-term process and an iterative one as well. You
Absolutely
can't, it's very tempting to just want to jump at a place that looks like it needs help, but you have to consider the community's relationship with other organisms, the long-term effects of your actions, and just what might be those shifts in the future caused by different pressures. So
Right.
Great job. We do have some questions. I will go through and start reading them for Sam, but feel free to keep them coming. First one is from Peter, who says, how do the rare plants propagate if they don't survive to flower without assistance?
So that's a great question. So in the case that I showed with that St. John's wort, that oftentimes when they get eaten by deer, they'll come back the next year if the root system or the bulb is intact. It'll kind of come back the following year and try again. And so in our sort of successful go at that, it was because we caged up the plant before the deer were able to get it. So we finally got it at the right time. It flowered within the cage, and then we collected seed and we're able to successfully propagate it. So oftentimes in nature or within the Trust, when they're getting eaten, the population is not really expanding from seed dispersal, right? It might come back. In the case of the lilies, we would see them, I think it was 2 years we saw them never flower, but they would regenerate through the bulb each year, keep trying. So I hope that answers your question there, Peter.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight the incredible persistence and determination that Sam will just find like the smallest little leaf, and he will be determined to discover what it is and cage it. And it's just amazing to see, like, when it actually grows without deer browse, just what it actually turns out to be.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Next is, Betsy got you. She says,
yeah, Betsy, you got it right.
she saw your picture of the harvester and she says, that's the one you were on your belly foot again.
Well, good eye, Betsy. That's it. Let's see. I'm on here.
David Robertson. He says the Trust staff completed numerous deer browse surveys over the years that included somewhat detailed vegetation surveys. Have you looked through those deer browsing surveys for vegetation records?
That's a great question. So I actually, Josh Bruce, who was the former research coordinator, kind of pushed me in that direction several times. And I've briefly looked over them, and I think that in relation to the other records, it's definitely not as intensive of an examination of the data there. So I really should be looking at them, and I'd love to look at that in comparison again to the other records. So MP, that'll definitely be one we'll have to pull out and check out. I think the deer browse survey.
Yeah, we're in the process of kind of compiling all old data records in relation to land management and kind of parcel specific histories as part of our long-term management plan. So that's definitely on the list as a reference for compiling all that information. All right, Brandy Heron says, this is an amazing presentation and Sam is making me want to get on a plane right now and visit the trust.
Well, thank you, Brandy. That's very sweet. Thank you.
What are you waiting for?
Yeah.
In a few weeks, when we get the spring ephemerals, it's going to be beautiful.
Yeah, there you go.
And David Robertson agrees. All right, we have, I'm just scrolling all over the place here. We have Lenny Heron, who says, thanks to people like Sam who are saving nature as the spectacular place it is meant to be.
Thank you very much. That is, again, very sweet comment there, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Doug Nadel says, that was great. Thanks, Sam and MP. Thank you. We have a lot of volunteers in the audience tonight, and a lot of you are reforesters, or you volunteer for Free a Tree. And like, seriously, we couldn't do it without you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. MP, I mean, that is a huge part that I really wanted to focus on, but that's a presentation in itself to just show how the volunteer efforts at the trust and the time that gets spent and the work that gets done has freed up our time as staff to be able to look into these things. So yeah, again, thank you. You guys are sort of invaluable to what we're doing. So thank you.
For those of you who don't know, Reforesters is our volunteer run program where an individual or a couple can adopt a forest plot that we've planted as part of our restoration efforts. And so they do a monthly visit in their plot, and they help clear the trees of invasives and report any issues. And it's just a great way to get to know like a section of the trust, get to know the plants in the area. And it really freed up, as Sam said, the time of the stewardship staff to be able to direct to things like finding these vulnerable plant communities. And otherwise they were mostly clearing out these forest plots during the summer. So you really freed up their time.
Yep.
Grace McMacken. Hi, Grace. She says, have any pollen samples been taken from some of these rarer flowers? And if not, want to take me out on a few treks so I can?
Oh, that's awesome. We haven't done that, and I would love to do that. We should definitely schedule that. We haven't thought of that. I haven't thought of that at all. And I think oh man, imagine the world of information you could get from that. So we should definitely schedule that and maybe this season. That would be great.
We're in the process of trying to cage larger areas with exclosures around the trust to try to see what other plants like these are hiding in the seed bank. So hopefully we end up with more individuals and can do this sort of thing as Grace is suggesting. But yeah,
I would love to see it. I know with the ragged fringed orchid I brought up earlier on, we had set up a sort of a game camera with a macro lens on it. We rigged something up to try and document what exactly was pollinating that, because there's nocturnal moths are the recorded insect that pollinates that. And it was sort of an exciting thing to try and track down, but we never really worked that. It was hard to get it just right, but that sounds like a great way to obtain that kind of information. So that'll be great.
Christy Bruce says that was absolutely wonderful. Keep it up.
Oh, thank you, guys. Thank you to both the Bruces. That's I was glad to see your name pop up here.
Robin Eisman says our meander surveys both on right next to and off trail? Looks like you're sampling fairly heavily in areas you're covering.
On and off trail. Oh, definitely majority off trail. Right. Yeah. So I would say almost all of it's off trail. Right.
Yeah. Like we do sometimes intersect with trails on our, so basically these surveys are transects, and we just put down a quadrat at those 50-meter intervals to get like a snapshot of like what plants are there and the abundance. So we have a good record of what's in the canopy and then what's in the shrub layer and then the herbaceous ground layer. So most of the time it is off trail, and that's kind of one of the other points here is we have these plants are under deer browse pressure and invasive pressure, but they're also in more remote locations further away from trails, and that's been good to keep them away from compaction, due to lots of people stepping on the soil or accidentally stepping on the plant itself. So visitor disturbance does play a role in these plant successes. So we do find that these plants are in more remote locations, and so that is definitely a part of the surveys, mostly off trail. Do you have anything to add to that, Sam?
No, that's exactly it. Yeah, I think it's kind of funny, right, MP, that it's kind of like this hidden world in the trust when you go off the trail, and that is where we've definitely focused our efforts primarily, is these sort of out of reach areas. And again, like you said, that the human presence can be a major disturbance. So yeah, we're definitely intentionally going off of the beaten trail, so to say.
Yeah. Brett says, yet another reason that I continue to renew my membership every year. Thanks for a great presentation. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. That is great.
Yeah, thank you. Your membership, like your money goes directly to this research and
Absolutely.
and other research and programs and operation that we do here. So thank you very much. Your membership means a lot to us. Betsy says, terrific presentation. Thank you, Betsy. Giselle says, are you able to share your findings with similar trusts and land management groups? And if you have, are there any regional patterns emerging?
So that's a good question. I would say that a lot of the records that get inputted into iNaturalist are utilized by people that may be studying individual plants or plant communities. Again, sort of scaling up, you can utilize that locational information from iNaturalist. We don't really, I wouldn't say that we share the entirety of our records with any specific group. And then in terms of regional patterns emerging, I would say that one interesting thing, actually, that's a good question. One interesting thing is like the records of some of the species that, when we talked about NatureServe, some of the things that their classification in terms of how threatened they may be, when we find things that are sort of exceedingly rare or very threatened, that information is shared with Natural Heritage, Pennsylvania Natural Heritage, which is a sort of a subset of the DCNR. So they're able to utilize that information, and it gets put into their sort of collection of data to say, here's it potentially changes a distribution map of a species. But I think primarily it's just to have a really good standing and understanding of the sort of overall presence of a plant within the state. So I would think that's really the only group that we're actively sharing information with is Pennsylvania Natural Heritage. But great question.
Yeah, I hope as we start moving into kind of protection strategies to try to protect these populations, we can share these strategies with other trusts that are undergoing very similar conditions within our county and in our region, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Abigail Long says, great presentation, Sam.
Well, thank you. Abigail sat through this last night with me and helped me practice. So thank you, Abigail.
David Robertson says, I believe that if we found a new species during the deer browsing surveys, we updated the vegetation records.
That's sort of what I was thinking. I swore I remember Josh talking about the revised Mitchell survey being some of those species being included. So that might have been, I think that's one reason why I wasn't going directly to those browsing surveys for new species outside of the other historical records, but I'm still sort of curious. I want to look into those and just see the whole entirety of that, because I've never really given the time that deserves. So I'll definitely be looking more into that and add that to the pile, right? MP, of all those records in your office.
Karen Campbell says, have you ever had any insect inventories?
So me personally, the same way that I was recording through iNaturalist, the plants, I have a large amount of butterfly, specifically butterfly records. There's a butterfly enthusiast, Will Curling, who's sort of like my mentor with the butterfly kind of learning and just understanding throughout the Pennypack. And he and myself have sort of compiled a pretty strong list of butterflies within the trust. The other side of things is, though, we have Sarah Pelleccia, our entomologist, who has been doing ongoing surveys and has compiled quite the list of insects. So I think mine kind of dwarfs in comparison to what she has, especially because it's really kind of concentrated onto butterflies. But so that would be a yes. So we do have, we're sort of in the process of an insect inventory because we're fortunate enough to have an entomologist on staff currently.
Yeah, I'm sure she'll do a talk on her findings at some point before next fall. So that'll be exciting to see.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Robin Eisman, she says, so you're wandering off trail to do these surveys, correct? And ever looking, say, under newly fallen logs that might be naturally protected from deer?
Well, that's a great question, Robin. I think not in the case of a fallen log, but that is the mindset that I often have when I go out to look in locations that would naturally deter deer. So maybe not a fallen log, but for example, a rocky cliff that might have a ledge where MP is saying to me, Sam, do not step on that ledge. Please don't step on that. But we'll go and look at these areas where deer will naturally won't go onto. And in those places, they can be really rich with plant diversity. So that's a great question. And again, yes, we do definitely wander off trail quite a bit. Looks like we have one more here, MP.
Yeah, looks like it's Brett, and he's asking if you would have the PDF of the 1900 paper by McElwee.
Absolutely. I would love to. Oh yeah, there you go. Thank you for sending that. And I would love to send out an email too to everyone who registered of maybe a compilation of all the reference plant list that we talk about. There's some other ones that weren't really included, but I think that stuff can be really interesting to kind of get your hands on and take a look at. So maybe we'll be able to work that out, MP, to send that.
Yeah, great. I'll send out the recording to everyone the following day, and so I'm happy to forward along any documents you want to add to that.
Perfect. And thank you for sending that in the chat, Rob.
So I think that's all the questions we have. So we'll conclude for the night. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Sam, for your talk tonight. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Really good. Take care.